Thanks for coming to a talk at South by about toilets. So I'm Cal Thompson, pronouns they, them. I'm based in LA and Vermont, and I'm the VP of Product Design and Research at Headspace. I'm a little squeamish about butts, which is why this photo is here. And outside of work, I'm an artist and a mindfulness teacher.
I'm Eli Robinson, pronouns she, her. I'm based in LA, and also we're renovating a house in Vermont. Cal and I are doing this project together, so I'm from there. I study rules, design, and mobility. I'm really interested in how and why people break rules. I have been a UX researcher, strategist, leader, and general experience designer at a number of companies and in a number of different types of settings. And I think farts are funny. One thing that is important to bring up is that this talk is going to be referencing restroom experiences for a lot of different types of people. And I just want to point out that this is an experience that I've been othered in since I was a child. My entire life, I've been the person who's kicked out of the bathroom, whether it's the boys' room or the girls' room. I'm quite comfortable with that experience, but it's just something to say that because this is a trending subject of the moment, it's not a new subject. Some of us have always been going through that. And I'm actually quite used to it.
All right, so we're standing on the shoulders of poo giants in this talk. So I hope you read some of these books after the talk. At the very end, we'll have a QR code so you can see the book list. There's truly a lot of literature on this topic. More than I was expecting when we went into this. So the toilet book is my absolute favorite. Highly recommend. All right, so we have a particular attitude about inclusive design, and some of you as designers are probably familiar with this slide from Microsoft. This is their universal design principles, but it's really around universal and inclusive design, helping people at both permanent kinds of need, temporary need, and situational. And what's amazing is when you design for any of these levels, you end up helping everyone within that vertical. And so as we go through this talk, you'll see examples of how better design in this area could help people across the board.
As often happens with design, there's a perceived problem, and then there's the actual problem. When we set out to address the perceived problem, which is about gender segregated restrooms and how to be more inclusive with trans identities, we quickly learned that that's actually just the perceived problem in this subject area. It's not the actual issue. Because of our human reactions of disgust and avoidance, we haven't yet solved for the real problem, which is a modern civilization issue, and it isn't just about restroom inclusion. We're using sewer technology that's invented about 5,000 years ago by nations with abundant water, and we're paying for it in catastrophic ways in our contemporary time. We're going to enlist you to try to help address all of the issues that we would set out to solve for.
All right, so choosing your restrooms was a great photo from a restroom in Kyoto that I was at last summer. It was a very all-inclusive bathroom. We'll show you a photo of it later. And Lewis Mumford said, you can judge the quality of a civilization by the way that it disposes of its waste, which I thought was a really fascinating piece. And you know, I think you're all aware of this, but it's nice to feel sex and gender pervade nearly every aspect of our lives. Each time we use a public restroom, shop for clothes, fill out a form, we are insistently reminded that we must be either male or female, men or women, boys or girls. We're given a lot of choices and reinforcement.
The thing is, the whole area is a red herring. This whole topic of gender is designed to avoid real issues of our time. And there's some big issues, but currently there are over 1,000 state bills restricting LGBTQIA+ community just since 2020 And most of them are about trans people. I'm talking about the United States here. These are the fatbergs of our political process, clogging up valuable legislative time. What's a fatberg? So you know how you're not supposed to pour bacon grease down the drain? And also, you're not supposed to flush wet wipes, even though it says you can on the packaging.
Don't do it.
The reason is because those two buddies get together and they make lard icebergs in plumbing, and they plug up pipes. It's actually created a total catastrophe in London, 2013. They had a plumbing blockage that was the length of the Tower Bridge. It was a great big fatberg of lard, and it took weeks to resolve. Super disgusting. People in London named it Fatty McFatberg. They were pretty excited about it. It's now in the museum, and it's one of their most popular exhibits. But the point is that our political process is jammed with a similar type of rubbish, and it's causing us to have serious backflow that we need to start working out.
So I know that, a lot of us are aware of what happened with Next Benedict in Oklahoma. I want to point out that, that not the first situation where that happened, and I know that it's emotional to even talk about trans and non-binary access to restrooms. But I want to point out, I think this is really important, that Oklahoma, which is where Next Benedict lived, has the most bills in the nation targeting the LGBTQIA+ community. So there's a real culture that was created around that. This year alone, 54 bills that are in flight that are attempting to restrict trans and queer people from having mobility in society. And we'll talk about this as we go through this, but really having access to a safe public restroom is your ability to function in society. So, as we talked about earlier, we're given the opportunity to pick a restroom anytime we go into a public place. And in rich places or poor, and more than anywhere else in public life, toilets inscribe and reinforce gender difference. You can see these amazing different versions of, even in the binary, there was still some variations. I'm definitely this character on the top right, the little squiggle, the one that looks like a road with a head on it. That's me. Does this sign help you know where to poo? Does this one? So the average person uses the toilet 7 times a day. That's 2,500 bathroom visits per year. So if those are public restrooms, which they're not always, our home bathrooms are not gendered, that's a lot of repetition and creates a lot of reinforcement. And we all know that reinforcement is how people learn. And so that's why there are some people that are hypothesizing that the pandemic actually softened people's experience of their gender, and there were more people who came out as queer, non-binary, trans during that time period because they were able to be in their own homes, in their own sort of safe private spaces versus public spaces where they were reinforcing that gender. There are a lot of genders around the world. The male-female binary is just one construct. These are just a few of the many genders that exist in cultures all over the globe. And you can imagine that folks who identify within these different, identities and spaces along a spectrum would have a lot of trouble picking a male-female bathroom. At this point, thankfully, some businesses are just playing with it, and they're like, whatever, here we go. So, you can see, this is my favorite on the far right. This is a Ruby Fruit in LA. It's a lesbian bar, and they were just like, no TERFs. And also, that bathroom plays only Indigo Girls 24/7. The music is incredible. You go in and you're like, this is heaven. So separate public toilets are really one of the last remnants of the segregated life of separate spheres ideology for men and women in this country. Now that the rules of etiquette no longer demand that the women leave the men to their brandy and cigars after dinner in polite company. So why are we doing it?
So how did we get here? Let's go over our history.
We had a lot of fun writing these.
So there are 5,000-year-old toilet ruins in a place called Skara Brae. It's a Neolithic settlement on an island in Scotland, where people lived in clustered earthen home communities. And each home had its own little water closet, you might say, with a trough, and they would use water to pour their excrement down the trough out a chute that went off a cliff and into the ocean. So this is the first known sewer system in a certain kind of way, of a fashion.
And around the same time, a little after this, the Minoans invented flush toilets on the island of what is now known as Crete. They were incredible artists, by the way, had to shout them out for that. They had pans on the roof that collected rainwater, and then they would tip that down, and it ran through really well-built clay pipes that would flush the toilets out to the sea. What's important to note is they were an island nation. They had very little land, lots of water. They were like, get our poop away from us. There's not space for it, because it was a huge society. And basically their toilet system is what we're using today. So they became the Mycenaean Greeks, which then inspired the toilets of the Roman Empire, which then inspired, and you'll see. So these are the sewers. On the left, we have Cloaca Maxima. This was the ancient Roman Empire sewer, which actually in some places is still functioning today. It was that well built. And when London and Paris built their sewers in the late 1800s, they just copied the exact same design. They were like, it worked for the Romans, so why not? So unfortunately, those amazing public toilets that some of you have seen photos of ancient Rome, they disappeared with the fall of Rome. And the sewer technology, just was cut paste later in Europe. So there was this time period where people just used chamber pots, and that's basically a bucket, that you go to the bathroom in, and they emptied them in little privies out back or cesspools behind the homes, or if you were really lucky, they emptied it out the window onto you as you were walking by. And this led to some absolutely incredible art. I mean, there's really nothing you can say more than these little floating turds. As the cities grew in Europe, they actually became overwhelmed with waste. Like it was in the streets, it's everywhere, and they just wanted to go away. Meanwhile, across town, Edo, which is now Tokyo, was twice the size of London and was immaculately clean. And this is because they very much valued what they called night soil, which was our poop. And the farmers would come into Edo and they would load up wagons full of poo, take it out to the farmlands and fertilize the soil with it. And the reason that they did this is they had very sandy soil that needed constant fertilization, unlike the very rich farmlands of Europe. And so they would take this poo out, and then in return, they would give the city dwellers rice and vegetables. This kept the city super clean, and there was a visitor from Portugal at the time who visited and said, in Europe, we pay someone to carry our excrement away. In Japan, they buy it, and they give us rice and money in exchange for it.
Some Japanese villages placed buckets on the street. Our villagers would place buckets on the street to collect urine for fertilizer. In fact, also landlords, the entire structure of rent was based on how many people lived in the home, because everything that went in the privy was the possession of the landlord. So the more people who lived there, the lower the rent, because the landlord had more to sell for fertilizer, for night soil.
So if anyone's ever brought a bottle of wine to a dinner party, there was a slightly different tradition in Japan at the time, and this is actually where the origin of a hostess gift came from. A hostess gift at this time in Japan was going to the bathroom after dinner at your host's house. So it was considered good manners to come to their house, eat a great dinner, and then show that you love the dinner and you love that wonderful warm hospitality by leaving a deposit in their outhouse, which they then owned and could sell.
Meanwhile, in Europe, they were having a race to get rid of waste. Hundreds of years of innovations brought toilets closer and closer to the flushing toilets we're familiar with today. We're not going to go into that. We think you probably know enough about the general evolution of flush toilets. And it's pretty easy to research, but there was various stages that have to do with changing the shape of the pipes for hundreds of years, changing to affect smell, ultimately. But smell could not completely be handled by the toilet fixture alone. Sewers were also finally installed in cities in the late 1800s in Europe, and They were all about disguising and hiding biosolids to keep it away from polite society. And this established the plumbing infrastructure that we still live with today. So speaking of entering the modern era with toilets, before the mid-1800s, in the US and Europe, there were no public restrooms for women. The public sphere belonged to men. So women had to use the loo at their friend's house or at home. When you can't use a public restroom, you can't engage in public life.
So there are a few examples of sex-segregated water closets or bathrooms in public spaces in the US before that time, before the end of the 1800s. But really what spurred this and what actually created the first law that mandated separated toilets for women came in 1887 in Massachusetts. And I don't know if any of you all remember the Industrial Revolution, probably not, none of us were born. But this was the first time that women were going into the workplace. So it basically went from cottage industries at home to women working in textile mills. And let's be honest, children also working in textile mills. These are some of the amazing women who are working in Lowell, Massachusetts as textile workers. And by 1920, 43 states in the US had adopted legislation that mandated that workplaces, specifically factories, separate men and women and have separate facilities for them. So it actually became a law that went into the International Plumbing Code. And you might wonder why? Like, couldn't they just use the same bathroom? It was because there was a very deep and profound social anxiety about women leaving their separate sphere, which was the home, and entering the workplace. It made people very uncomfortable, so they tried to make almost living room-like environments in these public bathrooms that were for women.
Having a separate but equal public bathroom is often the first step towards inclusion in society. However, in practice, the separation of accommodations reinforce the structures of inequity. Inclusion comes in waves through hard work of activists, but the interesting thing is we do have precedent for other times that people have been excluded from public restrooms. During the Jim Crow era, Black men were falsely portrayed as sexual predators by white conservatives. This idea would the concern was that they would endanger the modest virtues of white women. This should sound familiar to some of the rhetoric we're hearing today. They claimed that Black people had more venereal diseases and could spread them to white people by sharing toilet seats. White racists used this to justify segregated restrooms, racially segregated restrooms. During the gay liberation movement and the AIDS crisis, conservatives transferred this argument, claiming gay people were the carriers of contagious disease and that they should be feared in public restrooms. So while no formally separate facilities were built at the time, there was an enormous wave of hateful propaganda and fear-mongering that some people here might remember. And then disability advocates also. So all of this is happening sort of in waves and also simultaneously. Meanwhile, disability advocates organized in the 1970s to identify the absence of public restrooms to significant institutions. They finally got the Americans with Disabilities Act passed in 1990, ensuring access to public buildings and accommodations like bathrooms. However, many accessible populations continue to have separate accommodations that are not always equal. Even accommodations that are designed as accessible might be inadequate for meeting the variety of needs that are categorized within this disability umbrella, as highlighted by the disability advocate activist above, who pointed out areas of the ADA compliant restroom that they were provided in a hotel that did not meet the standards that they actually needed. It's also noteworthy to acknowledge that ADA bathrooms often double today as the all-gender facility. What it does is it outs the user for whichever reason they're using that room. And by having a separate entrance, it reinforces the message that these populations are different and should be separated from the rest of the population. Meanwhile, women's restrooms still don't exist everywhere. We know this is a global issue, again, just still focusing on mostly the United States here, but just in the United States. The US Senate didn't have a women's room until 1992. The US House of Representatives didn't have one until 2011.
Not that long ago.
Not at all. My smartphone is older than that. Where do they exist? Or where they do exist, sorry. Where they do exist, men's rooms often have no line. I'm sure we're all familiar with this. While women have long lines. The reason is because men's rooms have 2 times the fixtures for elimination because of urinals. So the sort of separate but equal concept was actually not weighing against how much space someone might need in a facility. Some women's rooms are also late additions to historic buildings, so they're in an unusual place for their walks. There's sort of some famous stories about epic walks women have taken to use facilities that are really not equal to the ones that their counterparts have to go where their counterparts go, including Hillary Clinton's political campaign. And to this day, missing or unequal facilities there are missing and unequal facilities in many institutions of power and higher education. So,
yeah. So this wave of anti-trans laws are really just, I mean, you can see that it's just the newest era of attempts to exclude a group from public life. But what we want to point out, and this is really important because it gives a lot of hope, is there is a pattern here. And the pattern seems to be that this kind of targeting of saying, hey, you can't use our public restroom is really just the first phase in most of these activist journeys that ends up triggering a very powerful civil rights movement. And it ends up triggering inclusion of some form, if not perfect, but much more inclusion down the line. I do want to point out, so this is 2024, so we're talking 3 months. We've had 522 bills that have been proposed. 10 have passed. Thankfully, 31 have failed. This is in the United States. But there's a great website, yesterday, translegislation.com, if you want to check it out. Yeah, we checked the stats, a week ago, and it had already 8 more.
Numbers just like double every time.
Yeah. All right. So, we'll close this moment in history and we'll get on to some exciting design pieces after all. This is a design track. But we want to share, unless they're affected by it, most people don't notice the prevalence of the binary at this point. We're super conditioned to it. It's super normal. But future generations will. They'll notice it the way that we would notice if there was a separate restroom based on race. And yeah, so here's the important thing. How do we actually get over our disgust or our distrust of each other? Oh, sorry, thank you. our disgust and distrust of each other and move through that and actually accept it and integrate all of it. Because there's disgust around the topic of bathrooms. There's also a lot of fear of other humans. So I'm actually going to guide you on an exercise in a moment.
Studies have found that high sensitivity to disgust is a predicator of authoritarian attitudes, which include prejudice.
So, we can overcome disgust and separation.
But how?
By being present and permitting integration, by not avoiding things, by welcoming anything into our awareness. And so acceptance, it's really about adapting to change, whether that's in societal surroundings or your own life. And part of that adaptation requires accepting impermanence and change. And I work at Headspace, so it's almost obligatory that I guide you in an exercise. And there's a crew of Headspacers over here who know that our teachers at Headspace do this for us often. But meditating actually reduces adrenaline, it reduces cortisol levels, it can increase tolerance, it can increase feelings of acceptance and compassion. So what we're hypothesizing is it can help us move through disgust, and it can help us actually innovate the space of bathrooms and sewers and toilets by accepting what is for what it is. All right, so this is an audience participation, and I don't want you to look at one person in particular, just look around the room at each other, and I'll guide you. So look around the room at the people gathered here. Just look generally at others in the room, and decide to yourself, these people are gross. They are so gross. They're here, you know, you don't know what they've been doing. They're maybe partying late last night. They could maybe get you sick. What if they have a cold? What if they have, something contagious? Do they look like a little dirty to you, maybe? Like a little gross? What if they're different than you? You know, they don't like the same things as you. Like they don't care about the same things. Play with feeling a little disgust towards the people in this room. Notice your disgust. Like deliberately decide, these people are gross. Look at them with that filter on them. Okay, so how do you feel? Maybe a little farther away, maybe a little grossed out, maybe a little separate from the other people in the room. And so now I want to shift it and look at them differently. Look at the folks in this room as people you admire. They came here during South by Southwest to a poop talk. They came here for that. Maybe they're a potential friend. Maybe people that are this weird are your right collaborators in your future in design. Maybe they're wearing something really interesting. Notice the interesting fashion they're wearing. You know, these are people who are coming from all over the world. They're wearing like really interesting jackets. Just notice their fashion. Get really interested in them. It's very special that they came from wherever they live, somewhere else on the planet to here. And get really interested in like what they uniquely bring. Pretty unusual that they're here. They're different, but they're very interesting. And so see their presence today as special. Notice that they are really, really quite lovely. And look at them with that filter on them. And then now notice how you feel. Do you feel closer to the room? Do you feel maybe more interested in them? What else? You might feel something different. So acceptance is this. It's this feeling. It's this connectedness. And you may have noticed when you were grossed out, there's this feeling of like arm's length. You're like, whoa, get it away from me. But acceptance is really this ability to move forward together. All right, so now the actual problem. We talked about the perceived problem. Here's the actual problem around toilets and bathrooms.
Future generations will wonder why we mixed potable water with poop every time we flushed. We're wasting one of the world's most versatile and critical natural resources and treating it like trash. Water is valuable. We pay for it. Poop and pee is valuable. Mixing them all together is not valuable. Everybody poops a pound a day. Everybody pees 2 pints a day. Toilets use 18.5 gallons of water per person per day. Meanwhile, urine contains phosphorus, nitrogen, and potassium. Those are called NPK in the industry. They're the same core ingredients as synthetic fertilizers. And they saved Matt Damon's life when he got trapped on Mars. Why are we manufacturing synthetic fertilizers and mining phosphorus when we already produce them every day for free? 2/3 of the nitrogen and half of the phosphorus that farms use as synthetic fertilizers run off as pollutants into our waterways. This creates harmful overgrowth of algae and other plants, upsetting our water ecosystems. The production of nitrogen fertilizer is an energy-intensive process that uses natural gas. It's responsible for over 1% of the world's total energy use. Meanwhile, we're using 2% of the US's electricity in wastewater treatment plants to separate these same materials from our water.
About half of the world's food supply actually depends on synthetic fertilizer right now that is produced from non-renewable resources. This is this wild pile that shows you what happens when you make phosphorus. So for every 1 ton of phosphoric acid that's produced for synthetic fertilizer, it actually creates 5 tons of radioactive phosphogypsum, and they store it in these huge random mountain piles because they don't know what else to do with it. So they're like, here you go. Now, and this is again where we have to work on our acceptance, if 10% of the US population collected their urine, we could retrieve 363 tons of nitrogen and 22 tons of phosphorus per day. Now, I want to point out that, there's a lot of phosphorus available in pee and poop, but this could actually account for 22% of the total global phosphorus demand. Phosphorus itself, the one that they're mining in those, and then leaving behind the detritus and those big piles, it's actually finite. It's sort of like peak oil. They think we're going to reach peak phosphorus in 2030. So it is like a non-renewable resource that we are mining for.
So, some people, fortunately, have been working on these issues.
Thank goodness.
It's time to close the loop. There are great design solutions for desegregating bathrooms, and they're just beginning to get traction. We're seeing them more and more in restaurants, clubs, dorms. I'm sure you've seen some. There's one in a hotel around the corner from here that I noticed. They're becoming increasingly common. And that's what it's going to take, is these are going to just need to keep becoming increasingly common until people realize that they're really not very threatening. SeaTac, the airport for Seattle, actually has one built into the airport now, which is a big deal because that's a pretty international, high optic spot. It's an airy, gender neutral bathroom with floor to ceiling stalls and collective sinks. And there's one company, or I'd say a collective rather, that is a group of people, of activists and architects who have gotten together to do, to create designs for this. We think they're so good at what they do that we'd rather just let them explain it in their own words.
Yeah, their designs are really the best inclusive bathroom design we've seen. So we'll just play this for you. Turn the volume up.
There is sound.
Gender neutral. This approach stigmatizes not only.
We'll start it over so you can hear the beginning.
The most common approach to the all-gender restroom is the single-user solution. This consists of a single occupancy, ADA-compliant bathroom labeled gender neutral. This approach stigmatizes not only trans and gender non-conforming people, but also people with disabilities by separating them from others. Stall advocates an alternative, the multi-user solution, which treats the restroom as a single open space, replacing the typical stalls whose revealing gaps compromise privacy with floor-to-ceiling partitions and communal areas for washing and grooming. We've developed a process for retrofitting sex-segregated restrooms that takes the multi-user approach a step further. First, we remove the plumbing stack wall and treat the bathroom as one open space. We then eliminate the corridor wall, treating the bathroom as a porous extension of the hallway. We add 3 different types of fully enclosed stalls, standard, ambulatory, and ADA, as well as caregiving rooms, which include sinks and changing tables. We add communal grooming and washing stations off the circulation path, and finally a lounge that transforms the corridor into an animated social space. This solution has 3 advantages. Restroom users can visually monitor one another, reducing the risk of violence. Gender non-conforming people aren't stuck between 2 options that don't align with their identities. And it meets the needs of the trans community, as well as a wide range of differently embodied people, including caregivers, the elderly, mothers, Muslims, and people with disabilities. Stalled has also developed a prototype for high-traffic spaces like airports that reimagine the restroom as an open precinct animated by 3 activity zones: grooming, washing, and eliminating. We're promoting inclusive restrooms through 3 initiatives. We've compiled our research into an open source website accessible to designers, students, cultural institutions, and municipalities. Stalled team member Terry Kogan is spearheading our initiative to amend the International Plumbing Code to make the multi-user solution code compliant. And through lectures, workshops, and publications, we're raising awareness that bathrooms are but one example of the need to create inclusive public spaces that allow a broad range of people to productively mix. To learn more about Stalled, please visit our website.
We're big fans, huge fans. Yeah. Hi. Hold on. There you go. Sorry, slide moment from the video. There we go.
Another team that's put together a solution we find admirable is a group that's made a product called Superloo. It's a cubicle system of a freestanding stall restrooms that can be installed anywhere that structural solutions, that have structural gaps, and in the restroom services. We just think they're really refined and cool.
Yeah, and they're modular, so this is a very easy one to install. In the UK, they put this in a lot of like older public buildings where they didn't have occupancy before. Okay, so you might have been wondering about the pee and poo. Where you were like, when are we getting back to that? Well, now's your moment, people. Okay, so for those of us who live in the US, our sewage and plumbing infrastructure actually needs to be replaced in the next 30 years. Like, it's actually aging and failing already. So now is the time to start to implement new systems and new designs. And some cities are actually already starting this. So this is from Kings County, it's Seattle, Tacoma. I just love this diagram, kills me. How it goes from toilet to eventually tomatoes, and the tomatoes go directly into the toilet. There's no person in between. But basically what they're doing is actually taking wastewater, and in their wastewater treatment plants, they're processing the sewage sludge, turning it into compost, and then selling that to farms to actually use to grow food, which is wild. But they're not the only city that's done that. Theirs is called loop fertilizer. But it actually, Washington, D.C. uses a similar process at their wastewater treatment plant, and they actually create a biogas from the sewage and then a compost from the biosolids, and it sells the compost, and they call it Bloom. It's a very nice name for what it is. Baltimore, Houston, Milwaukee, and many other cities are starting to compost some of their biosolids into fertilizer. And a big part of this is because if you really think about it, those centralized treatment plants are really expensive and totally inefficient. Like, you're essentially sending things very far away from your homes and buildings to this large facility to do all of that work. And really what needs to happen is more of that processing needs to happen closer to home. So they're calling it localized sorting at the building level. And that's what we want to get to soon. There's a whole neighborhood in Paris that's piloting this right now. They're doing what's called urine diversion. So they have special toilets that separate out your urine. Shout out to Sirota, who has such a toilet right in her very own tiny house, which incidentally we're staying in. This is a 600-person neighborhood, so the really huge neighborhood in Paris. You can see their little system. And what they're doing is actually piloting this here, but with the idea that they would then roll this out all over France. So they're trying it in this one new community, but this is really the first source separation project for France at the scale of a whole neighborhood. Like, there have been individual buildings, but not the whole neighborhood. And Bill Gates has actually put his money where the poo is by creating the Gates Foundation Reinvent the Toilet Challenge. He started that in 2011, and the whole idea is like funding innovation work around toilets. A lot of them, most of them, revolve around processing those biosolids on site. This was a system that is called the Janiki Omni, which I think is the most wonderful name, that they piloted into Car in Senegal, and it actually it creates its own electricity and even generates a little extra, and it turns the waste into drinkable water in 5 minutes. This GIF is him actually drinking water from that machine with relish.
This is a rest area in Vermont by John Todd. It's a living system. It uses plants, bacteria, and microorganisms to recycle the wastewater from the toilets of the rest area into clean water that then goes into the aquifer. The system is chemical free. It uses net zero energy, and it creates a closed loop hydrological cycle that people can observe. The plants remove odorous gases and support the denitrification process, and they harvest the nutrients such as phosphorus. The system's microbial organisms feed on the remaining sludge before remaining water goes into a lush indoor lagoon, and so it makes for a really nice rest area. And so this version really doesn't require machinery at all.
And there's this was actually from the Bill Gates Foundation. They funded this. These are called tiger toilets. They're in India. They're these wonderful, they're single-user stalls, but they're kind of like an outhouse, except for they have a compost bin built into the ground behind them. And they use tiger worms to break down the waste. So there's no smell, it doesn't attract flies like a lot of other outhouses. And it actually only needs maintenance every 10 years. Like they've been piloting these. And because that little compost bin that's built into the back it has all these sort of layers of different types of materials to filter the waste, it turns into compost. The only maintenance that they need to do in that 10 years is just like shovel out the extra dirt. They're like, oh, this wonderful compost. We have too much of it. Oh, so much abundance.
The soil toilet project in Haiti is about as old as an invention as you can get. It's a bucket that's collected to turn the contents into human manure. What they're doing there is they're capitalizing on the absence of the existing sewer system and just to harvest bio-waste at its source. So while it's an old concept, it's also an innovative solution in a time period where people are simultaneously advocating for plumbing as a freedom and a benefit that actually could potentially leapfrog some of the failures of our system that we're struggling with today.
Here's a different version of separation. Separating just urine.
Cape Cod is, the salt water is really rough on plumbing in Cape Cod. Septic systems struggle there, and the rising water table is making plumbing issues urgent. So the entire region has begun a collaboration with the Rich Earth Institute, which is also in Vermont, to begin to divert urine at the source. Once urine is pasteurized, it can be used as a fertilizer. About 8-to-1 ratio with water, and it's better for your plants than anything else that you can buy. So, and actually, for what it's worth, if it's in your own home, you don't have to pasteurize. But they've been installing these urinal-only outhouse sort of things for events, and as just the beginning of many steps to come. I actually visited the Rich Earth Institute in Brattleboro, Vermont. They're the leading experts on pea cycling, that's their term, and advancing policies that support biological futures for sewers and sewage. And their website will tell you anything you need to know if this is a topic that interests you, and we've converted you to want to become a pea cycler.
You can become a urine donor. You too. All right, so we're nearing the end. So what design talk would it be if we didn't give you like a big, cohesive, synthesized recommendation? So here we are. So we talked about the perceived problem. We talked about the real problem. Now, what is our actual recommendation? So design-wise, spatial design of stalled, top-notch, wonderful, beautiful way to integrate across genders, get rid of this weird gender reinforcement of making someone decide at the door like what gender they feel like that day.
And all body types.
Yeah, and all body types, exactly. And caregivers and parents and kids, just really including everyone in that space. And then also, in their design, using toilets that actually separate the biosolids so that that's not being mixed into our precious drinking water. And then capturing those nutrients on site and either composting them or, sterilizing is not the right word. Pasteurizing. I was like, pasteurizing. Capturing those so that we can then use those nutrients as fertilizer.
Whether that's done mechanically or biologically with the plant systems. We think there's some really good examples out there, and they just really need to be amplified.
Yeah, exactly. Especially the work of John Todd that Eli showed in Sharon, Vermont at the Rest Center. So thank you all for being here and coming to a South by Southwest talk on toilets. This is the book list. It includes all the books that are here, and if you scan that, there's more books. Oh yeah, and more, exactly. And if you would like to be our friends, please do. Oh, sorry, there you go. These are our LinkedIn and websites here, and a beautiful example of a composting toilet in Glover, Vermont at Bread and Puppet that was ADA acceptable, like even here in the middle of a field at a wilderness theater company. You can look at that wonderful logo that they painted on.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions? There's a mic.
Yeah.
Make sure it's on. I don't know if we did a sound check for the mic.
Hello? Yep.
Hi, Brandy.
Hi. Good to see you guys. I had no idea what I was getting into, and this is great. I have said for years, we will not take our water conservation seriously until we stop flushing it down the toilet. And in our house, we're blessed to have a yard. My husband fertilizes the yard by being outside every morning. My question is, with the rate uptick in the amount of pharmaceuticals that people are taking into their bodies, how does that play into this system of like, just put it back right on the, like into the environment? Are we cool with that? Or is the pasteurizing taking care of all that? Or please address. Thanks.
Good question. It's a common question in the sense that people want to know is how clean is our pee, right? And also this comes up with microplastics. And the responses that I have heard are varied. Pasteurizing would be the solution. Pasteurizing means bringing pee to a temperature that inoculates it. Essentially, it's something like it's not even boiling. It's a lower temperature than boiling, and then at that point of pasteurization, that information's on the Rich Earth website, what temperature to take it to. But that would remove anything that would be reactive. That would have been killed by the temperature increase. But another response that I've heard is that these materials that we're concerned about, things like medications or microplastics, are in so much of our surroundings at this point that the dilution that we're actually providing through pee is completely dismissible. It doesn't actually always show up as a statistically significant amount that's going to impact the food. That said, if you are fertilizing a garden, one of the reasons why Japan, it's theorized that Japan was so successful with this fertilization process for so long. It didn't have outbreaks of cholera and all of the other things that Europe is pretty famous for dying from, plagues and all this. The reason that probably is because they cook their vegetables in Japan. They don't really have a behavior of eating raw vegetables. So there's at that time, that was so the tradition of cooked or steamed vegetables actually is another level of pasteurization, essentially, to those chemicals.
One thing I want to add too, there's a University of Michigan study that they did. It was actually in partnership with Rich Earth, but they were testing the urine to see, what are the levels. And I'll send it to you because it's like worth actually reading. Very, very low, like the level of like an aspirin. So it's really not transmitting the way that we think it is when it's diluted the way that you would to fertilize a garden.
Do you have another question?
Okay.
Sorry. I don't have a question, more of a general comment. I grew up in the Midwest in Kansas City, and they just built a brand new terminal that was opened last year. And that sort of inclusive design of the bathroom, especially the new terminal, is something I'm sure maybe the designers of the bathroom took into consideration, because that new bathroom is pretty much aligned to like what y'all were talking about with being gender neutral, and it's all just like floor to ceiling stalls. And it's kind of interesting to see people either leaving or going through that airport, because Midwesterners are very traditional in their thought process, and it's kind of an interesting thing if you just sit and kind of just observe people not realizing that there's just not men or a men's or female bathroom, but nope, everyone's just going in and you can just wash your hands and do what you got to do and get out. And so just a general comment on that.
Yeah, that's cool. And absolutely, it's going to take a shift for all of us. As Cal pointed out, we've been trained to expect a certain kind of bathroom experience. So we're talking about changing it, and that's a big deal. The Thompson Hotel, the 4th floor has one of these. And I watched somebody walk into it, look at who was there, turn around and walk out. And then they went outside and I looked at them, look at the sign. I watched the whole thing just 2 days ago.
It creates gender panic.
Yeah.
Am I in the right place?
It kind of does to them what happens to me all the time. So I'm kind of like, this is awesome. But
yeah, Eli didn't mention in her intro, but I mean, you were talking about this before we did this talk. She was like, I've been kicked out of every bathroom because people are like, you're not supposed to be in the men's room, you're not supposed to be in the women's room. So it's fun for everyone to experience a little gender panic.
Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, I do think this is definitely the architectural trend. This is happening. It's not like we're introducing something y'all have never heard of. The point is that I think we want to actually say that we should be taking advantage of this opportunity while we're restructuring the physical structures to be more inclusive, to also be environmental. And we haven't heard that conversation happening. We haven't heard the collaboration between gender and disability rights activists working with the environmental topic. And this is something that we really don't think we have much time to mess with. So that's where we're coming from on that.
It's also interesting you brought up the floor-to-ceiling stalls, because that's something that the reason we have those super janky bathroom stalls that like start here and end here, and so you're hovering and there's a big crack and everyone can see what you're doing in there. It's supposed to be for safety. It's actually supposed to be for visibility, so that someone could see if there were two people in there, making out or like whatever, or if there's someone in there and there's some incidents of violence. But that's why the stall design was so interesting, because they were like, hey, actually, we could just pull that out a level and say, no, you're allowed to have privacy while you go to the bathroom. You're allowed to have a floor-to-ceiling stall. You can close, you can lock, live your life. But what we're going to do is actually open up the hallway and say, like, hey, this whole hallway, this big U-shaped space is visible. And so I think I was talking to Leslie about this when we were talking about like parents who bring their kids to a bathroom at an airport. Then the parent can actually stand and say like, okay, I'll be waiting right here. You can go to the bathroom, and then you don't even have to get into the whole kind of gender trouble of dads trying to bring daughters into the men's room at an airport or vice versa. So it really, it kind of like just pulls away that entire
completely
issue.
negates it.
Right, exactly.
There's like indicators for red or green if it's occupied or not. Everyone is washing their hands at the same washing hands spot. It tells you which stalls are open and which are not. And the color's great. It's not blue or pink or any sort of gender color stereotype.
Why not?
Yeah. So I was surprised, especially for Kansas City business.
Get it, Kansas. Good job, Kansas.
Awesome. Thank you all. Another question.
Yeah, we have 3 more minutes, so I think we could do one more question if you want.
Yeah, you named a lot of cities, but you didn't name Austin. Is it because the Dillo Dirt and the biosolids treatment plant out at Hornsby Bend is centralized, and these others are more decentralized? What is?
I think because of the ACL incident, we were
We were like
Dillo Dirt.
No, but yes, so Dillo Dirt is, so at Hornsby Bend, yes, exactly. They compost biosolids from Austin and then sold them as Dillo Dirt. And actually, I wish I had the slide. The Dillo Dirt logo is absolutely incredible. That armadillo wearing a bucket hat and galoshes, you all should look it up. It's so good. And like 8 back rolls. He's so cute. But Dillo Dirt is, it's biosolids from Austin, wastewater treatment plants. There was that incident at ACL where they had just spread it on Zilker, and then it rained and turned into a mud pit, and a lot of people got problems. Randy knows. She's worked in this space.
I do, but what you're pointing to in these other places seem to be slightly more like package plant style, like decentralized. Is that what you're pointing to as needing to catch on more, or is the city level? I mean, we're still using a lot of water to flush our poo through the Hornsby Bend.
True.
I mean, they are filtering
Cities are
it,
getting
and
there,
it's
right?
biofiltered and then released in the river and all that, but
No, ideally, I think the model that Paris is doing on the neighborhood level is honestly that's the least energy intensive, because it's being handled right on site. And then they're able to fertilize the gardens of that neighborhood with the waste from that neighborhood. So it really just becomes, there's much less travel involved.
right.
But it's not to say
Sounds
that
weird to say
Austin
travel.
isn't admirable for what it is, and especially when it first came out, was one of the coolest ones, it felt like, in the country. And so we didn't mean to diss Austin. We love Austin. And we're proud of many things about Austin, including some of their poo sorting processes.
And I think,
We
Brandy
love
Miller-
Armadillo.
Yeah, well,
Dillo
wasn't
Dirt.
Dillo Dirt started in the 90s too?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was really, I mean, literally, we moved here, I was like gonna work there. That was my goal when we moved here in 2007. Please.
Could you go back a slide and put up the list, please?
Oh, yeah. There you go.
Yeah, and this is really, there's so many good books on this topic. Well, we have a couple favorites. I think the one in the bottom right in that, called The Other Dark Matter, I think we put it at the top of the list because it's by a person who is a total poo expert, and we really admire her.
Yeah, I would say, and also Flush, the one right above it, is a really interesting one from a biologist.
Toilet one.
Yeah, toilet.
Pipe dreams is super good. We like this kind of stuff.
Also, the devil's element, that's this one upside down, is all about phosphorus, and it's about how it was discovered. And ironically, phosphorus was discovered by a guy who was boiling his own urine, who was an alchemist in the 1500s, and he thought because pee was yellow, maybe it could make things into gold. And so he was like, hey, let me see what I can do with this. And it ended up, because he boiled it so much, it ended up turning into pure phosphorus bricks, and it glowed in the dark. And he was like, I've come upon the most amazing
the wizard.
discovery. Yeah, it also was extremely explosive. So anyway, that's a side story that you can read about in that book.
Wait, but I think that with that comes the point, which is that we kind of glossed over and slightly gave a nudge to, but we really should just point out, if we'll make it explicit here. The creation of
Synthetic fertilizers?
fertilizer was an invention. It was an invention at the same time period that many other products were being invented with the intention of needing to replace those products. It was a part of the Industrial Revolution. The entire planned obsolescence. It was an invention of planned obsolescence. It came with it the creation of fertilizer as a product was 100% deliberate sale of something that people already had for free. And so with that, they had to make food really gross. And actually, even to say, like, we didn't include every book we read here, believe it or not. There are a bunch of kids' books on this topic, and they're all like meant to make kids read them. But so they say so the title's silly, but the title is always "You and Your Disgusting Poo" or "The Nastiest Thing You Can Do Today" or whatever. They're like always gross. The title is meant to teach you that it's gross, and then they teach you all about how the toilet works or whatever, but it is actually a lot of messaging that we are sending young people about this topic too. So
Yeah, around like body shame, and you should be afraid of what comes from your body.
yeah, and there was obviously a cleanliness issue there, so like there was a reason, but it's just there's kind of a lot to unpack as far as how we manage this transition if we were going to do it environmentally.
Well said.
Thanks again.
Thank you.